Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I hope that you're doing well. If you're new here, my name's Emily and this channel is all about life abroad, life in Canada, life in British Columbia, comparing things and just travel vlogs and videos and my thoughts about pretty much everything to do with being an expat living in Canada. So if you're into that kind of content, please don't forget to check out my channel and subscribe if you want to. I don't know if you've heard, but Victoria was named one of the best cities for millennials to live. It was also featured in Vogue, I believe, and maybe the New York Times. I could be lying about that last one, but it was featured in a number of different places to say that it is up and coming and exciting, which to a lot of people who know Victoria or are familiar with it can seem quite surprising. For those of you who are not familiar with Victoria, it has been long known as the city for the quote, newlywed and nearly dead, which is kind of ominous, but there it goes. Essentially, it was a place that people came early on in their careers and then when they retire. Famously, there's not really that much going on for people in between. And as someone who is not newlywed or hopefully not nearly dead, I thought that I would share a few of my opinions, not just based on Victoria as a city, because I've done that in numerous videos before, but basing it on the only other Canadian city that I know and have lived in, Toronto. A lot of people that I've met in Victoria have moved from Ontario and specifically Toronto, and it's very interesting to hear all of the different reasons why. Some people love it, some people really don't, and I decided to compile a list of different things where Victoria is better, but also where Toronto is better. Because although I always say that I love Victoria, there are a lot of reasons why Toronto is a better city to live. I know, even I can't believe that I'm saying that, but here I am. I'm gonna blame it on the nostalgia and I don't know, feeling homesick. It's weird, I used to feel homesick for England and now I feel like I'm homesick for Toronto. It's a very strange feeling, but perhaps people who have moved within a country that's not their own home country will understand. So I'm gonna start off with travel and transit. So as you may know if you live in Toronto, everybody complains about the transit system. Everybody says that it could be so much better. There are always issues with it, or it's too slow, or insert pretty much any complaint. But honestly, looking back at it, Toronto's transit system is far superior to Victoria's. There is the streetcar system, there are the buses, there's the GO train, Via Rail, there is the UP Express. Is it just UP or UP Express? I think I used to call it the UPS, but that's a shipping company, right? Anyway, it's the train that goes from downtown to the airport, which is just so useful. There's also the water taxi and the ferry that goes to the Toronto Island. Yes, Toronto also has an island, for those of you who did not know. I didn't know until I moved there, but yes it does. And of course, the infamous subway system as well. Although the subway system kind of leaves a lot to be desired, it is really useful, especially if you're going in between those points. Unless of course you get caught on a -30 day and the subway breaks down and you have to stand outside for 20 minutes in the freezing cold waiting for a replacement bus. That is not fun, and it's something that I had to do way too many times. Anyway, all that aside, Toronto definitely has a superior transit system to Victoria. I'm not especially familiar with the transit system in Victoria, but as far as I'm aware, there are only buses, and it is really hard to get around anywhere if you're going far distances. Unless you're going somewhere that is close, because Victoria wins in the bicycle department, and a lot of people here have e-bikes. It's that easy to get around on your bicycle. There are specialized bicycle lanes downtown. They even have their own traffic light system for bikes. It really is awesome. And after not owning a bike since I was, I don't know, 14 years old, I actually bought my own bike living in Victoria. In Toronto, that's not something that I would have trusted myself to do. Toronto, there are a lot of bikers, but it's not especially safe in Toronto. And there's a lot of things that I just wouldn't feel comfortable with driving around. Driving on a bike? Do you drive on a bike? Riding a bike in Toronto. Even though Toronto has its bike rental system, which I think is really good, for me, I wouldn't go on bikes in Toronto. And for that reason, I feel like it's so much easier to get around places that are close in Victoria than in Toronto, because you can use your bike, it's really easy to get around, whereas in Toronto, it's not as easy. Of course, you can just walk or take the subway. But Toronto definitely wins in the road transport and motorized transit system, and Victoria definitely wins if you're more of a bicycle person or an e-bike person, which are incredible. I don't have one, but I would absolutely love an e-bike. They are so, so cool. When it comes to travel, this is where the two places definitely differ again. And there's not really one that's better or worse. Obviously with Victoria, if you're going to go internationally, 9 times out of 10 you need to go to Vancouver Airport, which can be seen as kind of annoying, but for me, I kind of enjoy that. The flight from Victoria to Vancouver is one of the most beautiful flights I think that you could ever do, and honestly the views that you get, you'd probably pay for a tour to go see them. There are float planes in Victoria that you can pay to tour around the island in, and I feel like the flight from Victoria to Vancouver is just like one of those flights, except for you're just going somewhere. And it's like 15 minutes, so honestly, it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is where you want to go or where you go frequently. So for example, Toronto is a big, big international airport. It is the Air Canada hub, I believe. And pretty much every major US airline goes in Toronto, and pretty much every single major international airline goes into the Toronto airport. So if you're going to go to those places, it's definitely more convenient to go to Toronto. Obviously it has the UP train, which takes you from downtown to the airport, which is super, super helpful. It's super quick to get to the airport. The city is really, really close. It's about 20 minutes away in the car. And especially if you're wanting to go to the east side of the United States or pretty much anywhere in Europe, it's so easy. It was only a 6-hour flight from Toronto to Manchester, which is where I would fly to when I go back home to the UK. So that was really, really great. But over here in Victoria, we're a lot closer to the West Coast. So places like Oregon, Washington, California, Baja, Mexico, or Los Cabos in Mexico, places like Hawaii, and amazingly even Australia. That was one of the things that blew me away, because I've always lived in a place where it takes like 24 hours to get to Australia from wherever you are, and there's always a big layover. Whereas from here, if you go to Vancouver Airport, you can take a flight to Brisbane non-stop and it's like 15 hours. And that's amazing, because when I was in Toronto and went to Brisbane, it was a 15-hour flight just to Hong Kong, and then like a 6-hour layover, and then another 7-hour flight to Brisbane. So if you're going to those kind of places, it's definitely easier to get to from this side, obviously. And if you're going to places like Europe or the East Coast or Mexico, the Caribbean side of Mexico, or the Caribbean islands, which are also one of my favorite places in the world. And if you've never been, totally off topic, you should definitely go. But if you're going to those kind of places, Toronto definitely trumps Victoria in that sense. When it comes to hobbies and recreational activities and concerts and theatres, again, the two cities definitely differ. Toronto, it has way more options when it comes to theatres, when it comes to concerts, music concerts, sports. Obviously all of the major sports teams are in Toronto, the Blue Jays, the Raptors, and the Toronto Football Club. There are so many amazing theatres in Toronto, and all of the major productions tend to run through Toronto too, especially on their North American tours. So you can almost always catch your favourite theatre show or your favourite concert. All the major concerts go through Toronto, and that's awesome to have at your disposal. Obviously in Victoria, if you want to see that, Vancouver has a lot of those things. I'm not sure about the theatre scene in Vancouver, but I know that a lot of the concerts that go to Toronto also come to Vancouver. So it is just a short flight away, and a very nice flight, as I said before. But where Victoria is so much better is for the outdoor activities, for outdoor hobbies, and for hiking, the regional parks and camping, things like that. If you're more of an outdoorsy person, Victoria is far superior to Toronto. It just has, as I've said before, a wealth of nature. It has the most amazing hiking trails, biking trails, camping. It's pretty cool because over here in BC, you can camp for free in a lot of places on Crown land, whereas in Ontario, I had only ever come across places that you had to pay for. So it's a totally different experience here, and it really does depend on what your priorities are as to which one that you would prefer. And Victoria also has theatres too, and it has concert halls too. Obviously, they're not going to be as big as the Toronto ones, but it does still have an art scene. So there is still an amount of that kind of stuff here as well. But if you're into the bigger theatre shows and the bigger concerts and sports games, obviously Toronto is much better. But if you're more of an outdoorsy person, nature, especially if you like water sports, you know, fishing and scuba diving, paddleboarding, things like that, Victoria is far, far superior to Toronto. Another really big difference between the two cities is the weather. I've spoke about this before and you'll probably laugh at me because I literally moan about the Toronto weather all the time, even though I'm not living there anymore. But the two cities are so different in climate, not just in the temperature, but also the humidity too. Toronto has these beautiful hot summers, and Toronto definitely trumps Victoria in that sense. So even though the summers, in my opinion, are maybe a little bit too hot and they're very, very humid, it has the most amazing warm summer evenings. That is the biggest thing I think that I miss about Toronto, are those warm summer evenings where you don't need a jacket, you can just sit and it's just comfortable and lovely. The only downside to that is the amount of bugs and mosquitoes that you get, but for warm summer evenings, Toronto is just wonderful. Obviously, then you have to pay for that with the freezing cold winters. But of course, if you enjoy the winter and the cold, then that's great. Whereas Victoria has year-round beautiful weather. We do get some rainy days, but nowhere near as much as Vancouver and even Toronto. We get less annual rainfall than Toronto, and I think I've told you this before, but that is kind of like an island secret. Nobody tends to talk about that, but because of the Olympic rain shadow, Victoria has very little rain. We do have a wet season from, I think it's November to February, where we do get a significant amount of rainy days. But after that, it's pretty much dry all the time. And even if you do get a rainy day, I would say most days have some sunshine in them. Obviously, it is drier here in the summer. We don't get that humidity. And for me, I love that. But we don't get those warm summer nights. So I do miss those. But for the comfort of the rest of the day, it's a lot more comfortable if you want to like walk around, if you're like hiking, if you're doing those outdoor activities. I feel like the climate in Victoria enables you to go out at any time of the year. And especially if you're a big golfer, golf clubs are open all year round. That was probably the biggest selling point for Mike to come here. He's a huge golfer, and obviously in Ontario, and most of Canada, they shut down the golf courses in this wintertime because they can't play in the snow. But Victoria doesn't really get any snow, apart from maybe a couple of days here and there. So the golf courses are open all year round. So if you're a big golfer, then that's probably insightful information to know. Then on to shopping. So again, the two cities, obviously Toronto is much bigger than Victoria, but Victoria is the capital of BC. So there is shopping in both cities, but it's very, very different. Toronto is obviously far superior if you want to shop for those big brands, big box stores, US brands. So we're thinking like IKEA. Victoria doesn't have an IKEA, Vancouver does, but Victoria doesn't. So Toronto has an IKEA, which is super, super useful, or US stores like Pottery Barn, things like that. Zara is a big one, or just like the big kind of big branded stores are just not here in Victoria. To go and have those things, you'd have to go over to Vancouver, and although it's not very far away, it's still a bit of a trek. Like in Toronto, you know, you can shop in Toronto until like 9-10 p.m. and that's normal, but here in Victoria everything closes at like 5 or 6, so that is a big cultural difference. I don't particularly mind it, but sometimes there are those times after work when I'm like, oh, I wish I could just go and run some errands, and everything's obviously closed at like 5:30, 6 o'clock, and I can't. So yeah, Toronto is definitely more convenient in that sense. On the other hand, Victoria beats Toronto in its local shops, in its more boutique small shops. Because there aren't a lot of big branded stores, there are a lot of local stores, a lot of one-offs. You can buy local crafts really, really easily. There's a lot of amazing general stores, especially recently there's been more opening up, which are just these beautiful boutique general stores and just unique businesses, which I didn't see as much of in Toronto. Obviously there are some in Toronto, but I feel like it's a lot more saturated with the bigger brands. And Victoria does have some big brands too, so it does have a mix. There's like Lululemon and Hudson's Bay and Indigo here, those kind of like major stores. And there are a few malls around where you can see those big bigger brands, but generally in the downtown core, for example, I think probably because it is a big tourist destination, there are a lot of unique businesses, a lot of businesses that are only in Victoria and only have the store in Victoria, which I love. I think that's really great, and I've definitely noticed that I have bought way more local things since living in Victoria than I ever did in Toronto. So for local things, for local crafts and produce and small general stores and certain specialty stores, Victoria is definitely superior. But for those bigger brands like IKEA or US brands, then Toronto is definitely better. Onto food, and this is kind of a little bit unfair because of the size of Toronto and all of the different neighborhoods that are within Toronto, but Toronto definitely beats Victoria in a lot of ways. Whatever it is that you fancy, like whatever kind of cuisine that you want, you can always find, or at least I've always found, I can always find a really, really good version of that in Toronto. Whether that's pizza or Korean food or ramen or Thai food, Japanese, Indian, whatever it is that you fancy, you can usually find a really, really, really good version of it in Toronto. And of all of those things, I think the best thing that I ever had in Toronto was the pizza. The pizza scene in Toronto is unreal. And I'm gonna put that down to the fact that there are a lot of people of Italian descent that live in Toronto. It's kind of very similar to New York in that sense. There is a big, big Italian American scene, and the pizza scene especially is insane. Some of the Napoli style pizza in Toronto is probably some of, if not the best that I've had outside of Naples. It is wild. It's so good. There are so many different places that do it, and I feel like they really take pride in their pizza. I am a big lover of pizza, as you can probably tell. I feel very passionately about this subject, but Toronto's pizza scene is just incredible. On the other hand, Victoria does have a lot of different cultures and a lot of different cuisines, but nowhere near to the extent that Toronto does. And there are pizzas, pasta, Italian, that's all Italian, pizza, pasta, Italian. And in Victoria, there are a lot of cuisines that you can find in Toronto. There's just not as many, and they're not always, I have found, as good as you have it in Toronto. I think just because there's so much choice in Toronto as opposed to Victoria. Where there are like 10 restaurants in Toronto, there's maybe one in Victoria. But where Victoria really takes the biscuit, in my opinion, is in their sushi and their Canadian fare. The sushi on the West Coast is so incredibly good. I have never been to Japan, but I imagine that it is probably of an equivalent quality. And I put that down to the fact that it's right on the ocean. Obviously in Toronto, you're not going to get fish as fresh as here because it has to travel from the Atlantic or wherever it's coming from to Toronto. Whereas here, like, I can look out my window and see the ocean, and that's where my fish comes from. I think as well the West Coast really takes pride in their sushi, and there's quite a heavy Japanese influence too, which really helps. And I've just found that the sushi in Victoria and in Vancouver are far superior to anything that I ever had in Toronto. And also the Canadian fare. I can't say that I ever went to loads of Canadian restaurants in Toronto, but it seems that there's a lot more Canadian restaurants here, or perhaps there's just a lot more in a smaller place. And they really tend to take pride in their Canadian restaurants and their Canadian food, and it's really, really beautiful because there's so much local produce that is grown in BC, and whether that is fish or vegetables or fruits, you can pretty much get anything that you want in BC. So the produce here, especially for local fare and local cuisine and Canadian cuisine, is really truly phenomenal. And some of my favorite restaurants in Victoria and on the island have been Canadian restaurants. So for everything that you would ever want and dream of, and especially pizza, Toronto. But for sushi and Canadian food, I say Canadian food, but I mean like BC Canadian food, because there are all different kinds of cuisines across the country. But for that kind of stuff, Victoria is definitely the winner. And finally, this one is kind of a given, I guess, but I figured that I should add it to the list because this is an unfair list if I don't include lifestyle. But for a like fast-paced, exciting, you know, city slicker, climbing the corporate ladder kind of life, Toronto is obviously the better option. It is like a smaller New York City. It's got the big skyscrapers, the nightclubs, the exciting food scene and theatre, concerts, sports games, you name it, Toronto has it. It's pretty incredible in that sense, and in the summertime especially, when everyone is like out on the town in, you know, more normal non-COVID times, is truly, truly awesome. But for that more relaxed, slower, chill pace of life, and a lot of people get confused because I think that it sounds like I mean not exciting in comparison to Toronto, but for me, I find it just as exciting but in a different way. Rather than going to events and concerts and nightlife in the city, you're having adventures in the wilderness and going on hiking trips and going on boating trips. But it does just have this more relaxed, chill atmosphere. So if you're more into that, then Victoria is far, far, far superior. Anyway, I'm gonna leave that list at that. This has been a much longer video than I thought it was gonna be, but I really, really hope that it was beneficial, especially for those of you who are thinking about moving to Toronto or Victoria or trying to decide between the two. I hope this has kind of given you a little bit of an insight into what both of the cities are like and how it would be good for you or not good for you, whatever it is. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Doing that really, really helps to push this video to others that might also be interested too. So I'd really appreciate it if you did any of those things, and especially comment, because honestly, I've said this a million times before, but your comments really make my day. I try to get back to everybody, and if you do have a question, let me know, and I will try to answer it as best as I can. Until my next video, I hope you have the most wonderful day, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!